Welcome, everyone, to the next installment on Keen on Architecture Draw Along Sessions with World Religions based on the Village of 100 People. As you know, you have two ways to find the base drawing here, either by the PDF or by simply stopping the film once you see the clear image of the base, tick marks on the PDF, and then screen capturing that. Today, we're going to talk about the Blue Mosque in Istanbul. So to start with, we'll talk about the religion shift because the first three pieces we did in this series of exercises on history of architecture were Christian buildings. Now this Sunni Islam is Arabic for a code of behavior established by Muhammad, the final prophet and founder of Islam. So we're moving into a couple buildings based on that culture to complement the teachings of the Quran. So the practical conforming to Islamic law was the prophet believing to lead that perfect life, and a way of life that guides most Muslims in all the aspects of daily living to this day. There's no central authority. It teaches emerging from the complex system of jurisprudence. The art featured in most mosques is entirely abstract. It's not iconic or symbolic through statuary. So there are no images because they consider that a way to distract the mind of the individual Muslim away from the divine word. What you will see is calligraphy and the language of the actual text from the Quran that speaks to the traditions in Muslim places of worship. So in terms of getting started here today, we have a couple references. This is the model of the Blue Mosque we're going to draw from. We're going to draw it from this view shed sort of across the Bosporus because it sits on the water's edge there in Turkey, which straddles the two continents of Europe and Asia side by side. So Turkey is split on both sides of the continents, and also the city of contemporary Istanbul, the old city of Constantinople, was also split in terms of having a European and an Asian side to it. So as we draw this from the early part of the 1600s, about 1610, it sits next to its major predecessor and sort of reference for design language, and that's the Hagia Sophia, Holy Mary, which was done in 532 AD for Justinian, as he tried to do a third church on this site. The first couple had wooden structures, which became problematic with the candle work and lit fires on the inside. And so the second time it burned down, they decided to do it all of stone. And so that building from 532 still exists to this day. And so this is initially a Greek Christian Eastern Orthodox church that eventually becomes taken over by the politics of the Muslim Islamic world, and they convert it to a mosque. And that language of that being so sexual, the history as being a mosque, became sort of a stepping stone to a more contemporary one from 1610, sitting next to the Hagia Sophia, the Blue Mosque, which we're going to draw next. So we'll talk about it briefly in plan type here, which is always the inspiration for most architects as the one single piece of information that's probably the most precedental in terms of what's coming forth. And most architecture is really predicated on the geometries here. So if you look at the language down here quickly on the lower right, we'll see that Islamic culture is very steeped in traditions of pure geometries and the language geometries that we hold. So let's start with a pure square and then bisect that twice. And we saw it in the same Basel and Russia, that same type of notion of finding the octagon within these zones. And now we can come in and put a secondary square inside, which gives a majority of propriety to inside this square with secondary zones in the four corners. So what we have seen in Hagia Sophia, as well as this now for the faith-based, is the central dome is dominant with minor aspects in the corners, and then half domes in the side to have the same type of aspect that all architecture globally has to work with. When you take stone, heavy materials off the face of the earth vertically, the thrust is such that it has to be supported by using not just the circular or the square type of geometries of man-made form, but the actual triangulation to be the purest type of shape and structure because it allows for the reception of forces that are driving on the outside and counteracting those. So much like in the Christian churches, they were building out in section the idea of a large pyramidal shape on the site. So inside here is the splendid dome then, which covers the single space on the inside. We'll talk about the use of that in plan type a little bit later. And then there are small references to smaller domes in the corners. And then the others that support the architecture in that vertical thrust along a diagonal, these half domes that support it. And that's the language which we use to describe both Hagia Sophia as well as the Blue Mosque here, which was done in 1609. Its official name is the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, an Ottoman era historical imperial mosque located in Istanbul, Turkey. It sits next to the Hagia Sophia, like I mentioned, to this day, like many other sites globally we're going to talk about in this session here, is UNESCO World Heritage Sites, meaning that a sort of global aspect of varied people operating out of an office in Paris select sites they think are not just culturally significant to one people, but to the world. And so once you're on that site, it kind of tends to break down the barriers and say that we all share in the great qualities and creativity of mankind. So it majestically overlooks the Bosphorus, the natural border between Europe and Asia. And in the 17th century, it was a very turbulent time in the Ottoman Empire, and the emperor at the time there, the Sultan Ahmed, had a lot of problems with trying to use the coffers to build this over time, because they weren't having many successes on the battlefront where the winner gets the spoils. And so it was a taxation on the people, or more of a burden, and then he still was able to complete the building plan. So the structure has 13 domes and 6 minarets and a courtyard adjacent to it. Enormous structure is about 250 feet by 213 feet total. The 5 main domes are accompanied by 8 smaller ones, and the minarets reach to about 210 feet. So it's got a great scale and presence, as you can see by the little photograph we're going to draw from here on the right, sitting on the water's edge. What'll be interesting about this sketch too is we're going to draw it down to grade toward our horizon line here. We're so far pulled back that the projection is very long and thin for all the boxes to go to vanishing points way off the page. So it appears in this photo as if all the lines are horizontal, but in fact, they will cant back ever so slightly. And as the drum of the domes rise up here, they still look like they're flat and horizontal, and yet each one has got a very seductively small little arc to the base of things, which we have to include to make it seem like it's got volume to it. If all the lines that appear there as being parallel in this perspective are drawn in perspective as a flat line, that means you've no longer done a three-dimensional perspective, you've done an elevation of the building, which is a fine way to inscribe quality about the language of it. But we want to make sure we stay in three-dimensional scale, so we're going to honor, even though they're very oblique in this particular sketch, the movement of lines inside the actual series of domes here. So let's get started with some ideas about our view shed. And so if you look from this point of view, we're going to rotate over a bit so we see a little bit more of this as the subject matter, and then the courtyard adjacent to it will kind of trail off into garden space between it and the river. And so our dominant focus will be on the left third of the paper stock and then trail off to the right. So the front 2 minarets are dominant. The rest are all the same height, but they seem to diminish in perspective as they go back. So the tops of these make horizontal lines. So those will show us where our vanishing points are. So from this point of view, we'll start with the actual language you see from your sketch here. So you can see that the top of this meets in perspective with the top of that. If we connect those together, that's going to find our vanishing point on the left. And the same is for the view shed here. Moving back from this point to that, that's finding the right vanishing point. So very simply now at the top where those tick marks are, that's going to drive to a point now. And again, we're so far away from this across the waterway is that it pushes the points well far away. If we were to get on a boat and get closer to this, we'd be able to bring the points in and we'd be sitting more underneath the vaults themselves. So that shoots the left vanishing point far off the page here. And now the right vanishing point even further so, coming off the height of this one, you can see it's going to track well off the page to the right. So even though it seems kind of askew and not really formative for the sketch, we still have to honor that at some point all horizontals are going to connect to those 2 points in the distance. So what that does then, it connects back down to this point of reference, which is the horizon line of somebody just a tick mark higher than the water's edge itself. So if we're across the way, that would be our eye height at the base of the building. So what we'll do first is simply start to build out some of the form work here. So we'll stop kind of top down because this is the throw that goes the most vertical in terms of the massing of the building. And that's the arc of a very shallow dome here, which again is based off the language of the Hagia Sophia, where this pendentive dome then has the ability to float over the interior space because around the entire 360-degree arc around the dome of Hagia Sophia and the Blue Mosque, it's lit by fairly large windows. So the appearance when you're on the inside is of the actual ceiling lifting off. When it's a very bright sunny day, there's no sense of a dark, shadowed, burdened interior as the light penetrates in 360 around the space. And then it steps down to its base in a rectangular fashion here. And again, even though it seems flat here, it's going to vanish back to the right. So it's tilting down ever so slightly. And then we have the next dome, which supports it, the half dome. And so the underside of this one that we see up top here is ever so slightly canted up and then brought back down. And remember with domes that we saw at St. Paul, you want those little fish hooks at the end, which are going to wrap that volume around because that in fact is a very squat cylinder. We do the same down here and bring that around and down to show that cylinder as well. And then this comes down to a secondary place where it throws its weight, and we see then yet another arc of a shallow dome at that point. Comes up at the base here. And so a sequencing of the largest to the second largest to the support for the second largest, and then down finally to a very flat mural type of crenellated wall, which is going to be the deadlow, which supports the throw of the domes coming down in diagonals in this direction, that direction, that direction, and across the way from us. So that'll come to a certain point and then sit on a flat deck, which then has an arcade to be able to access various points of reference at the base of the mosque. So now we can probably start with the pattern of our minarets, and they are very tall triangular cones at the tops of all these. On the distance, so again, these two lines here are parallel, and they're both going to go back in space to the right. And over here, this will meet up with the sixth one in the distance. And here's the last one we see on this side. And then after they come to their support piece, we're going to see the underside of that rotunda for that pyramidal shape that's flying in space. So arc that around. And there'll be a singular shaft that supports that. And then the various stages of where the prayers are spoken from in these minarets as the stairway and insight take people up to various stages toward the top. And so we have breakpoints of 1, 2, and 3. Again, going back and vanishing to the left point, you can find the next ones, 2, and 3. And then coming across this way from the back, here's the second one. So they're all married into one line coming all across to find each other. So there's no guesswork on locating these segments along the way. And finding to the third. And that encloses sort of the ecclesiastical space and then the forecourt on the one side, but the final two minarets that are on the property. The mosque is decorated, so to speak, because it's actually the skin. So there's no real decor outside of the handmade tiles, and they're all not iconic. There's no symbol to them other than just the idea of it being tulip patterns, natural patterns. So there's no telling of a story. It just simply is, again, geometries. Later on in the course of upcoming centuries beyond 1600, verses of the Quran were added by a renowned calligrapher at the time. And so people then could read the message, and then the imagery themselves pops up in their imagination. Hagia Sophia was converted to a church later on, and then back to a mosque, and then finally back to simply a museum, and it lost its presence of that. But since 2020, they're allowing Muslim prayers again, even though it's really more of a museum and a major tourist attraction in the city of Istanbul. The Blue Mosque is nicknamed because of the blue tiles that decorate its interior. And when the light shines through off the Bosporus, it sends in the sort of secondary, if the sky's very blue, it lights up the interior with that kind of blue gaze to it. So we'll finish up some more of the base supports here, and then we'll start to sort of reach the idea that this sits on water. And so how do you show the reflection of this as a drawing? So what we'll do first is we'll come down and show the base where there is another set of two-story structures. In this case, they're double windowed height. They come right down to grade in the water's edge. And then this arcade, which you already did the base for, sort of shows its access point to that lower level. And then from here on over, there's an organized garden that is our base for the courtyard. So we're going to see less of the arcade of that because of the green space. So we're going to use it as a value along the river's edge. And some will be individual trees we'll see, and some will be sort of the growth of a sort of small forest that's adjacent to the courtyard. And we'll use that to kind of wash out the sketch of the plan here on the right, and let it just sort of trail off the page over here. So we'll really use our last minaret here as a way to kind of stop the eye from moving toward, again, the two-dimensional edge we stay away from. We render it so that this is our key aspect here, and it kind of generates the idea of consistency across and then sort of falls away as a sketch. So if we give some depth to the fenestration up here, we'll double up those lines moving across and double up those. And then finally these. And that'll start to give us a sense where we can do some of our values for the interiority, because again, every time you see that type of glazing during the day, the interior space itself, even though sort of contrary to your thought process, you'd think it'd be lit up and be brighter than the outside, but nothing can compare to the sun in terms of density of value. So those go darker for us. So first we'll simply pick our sun angle here, and we'll assume that our front elevation here is being lit, and then things on the left side here will receive the shade. So we'll come up to the edge of the dome here and show part of its quartered mass. Each edge here has got a large pavilion that supports it all four corners. There, and there are small dome structures that pick up the diagonal throw. And so we'll see one in the back and perspective back here as well. We can't see the fourth on the other side of the dome. So what'll happen is all the zones that are sort of in between us are going to receive less light. So we can start simply with the crown of the dome itself And again, our notion is that when the sun hits this, it's not just a straight line it moves on the arc of the actual ball, for lack of a better term. The shape and the volume of that end makes it sort of a hyperbolic paraboloid, and then softens up again and then hits another side over here. So there's sort of always a hot spot on the shell of the dome. And we'll do the same for this half one here. It'll come and then curl back a bit. And then as it rounds away from us, it actually gets darker too. So the sense is, when you're looking at something that's moving in 3 dimensions, it's not moving just left to right, it's moving left and right and then going back in the z-axis, that you're going to see more of the roof condensed into a small space. So the same tone here appears darker in the distance. And that's how we'll sort of make that shape look sort of bulbous in that sense. This, however, isn't moving in 3 dimensions, it's just wrapping around. So it simply is a left to right wash. And then here we'll have a little bit of throw as it goes left to right around that edge too. And then this one supports that half arch we talked about. So that's left to right. And then the rest of the stonework is receiving the light from this point until we get, because these are more mural qualities of flat buildings here that are supported on the edges. It kind of goes box-like once you're beneath the dome chambers. So this is all a squared off building at the Blue Mosque, and that's all receiving light. So we'll show some of the change there by some of the fenestration later. But in the case of the minarets, they are subtly shifting light across their skins. So they're receiving a lot of light on the right side and none at all as they wrap around this 180-degree turn in front. So we're going to come on the top of the conical areas and start by doing just a stroke on the side that doesn't receive light. And then the verticals that support it on the way down. And then we'll come to show the support, which actually has sort of an open wall for the prayers, and then a little bit of an angle support as it projects away from the actual form of the minaret. So a little positioning there in terms of when people step out. And we'll detail the ones that are closest to us, these 3, and then the 3 over here will be less, which will mean it'll create space to us, because if you're ever focused, let's say you're on site looking at the dome proper, and you're focused on this with your 2 eyes, your eyes don't have the capacity, if you're looking at this, to see detail over here. You'll see light, shade, and shadow, you'll see a form, but you won't see this type of detail. So we'll detail the ones here, which makes the idea of a fixed position of what's most important to the sketch so far. Okay, so we'll come back to this and we'll see with the sky later how much you want to employ more value there. But now we'll come over to the projection part of this axis of the plan, which is coming out towards us, which will cast a shadow on the planes that are adjacent to it. So over on this side, there'll be less light received because how this is going to cast a shadow. This pier will cast a shadow. This will cast a shadow back in there. That goes around the corner. And these are practically facing the other direction. So this part of the stepping down of it becomes less informational for us. And yet the front part at the base is closest to us, and that receives the full light that these skins do. So there also are, on the mural quality here, raising up to our first rotunda, is a series of blind arcades, which lessen the weight of the wall, but are there again to counteract the thrust of the dome. again, fighting physics, that the farther mankind builds off the face of the earth, the more dynamic the equation gets in physics to counteract that force. And then we'll take a value across here because obviously the stone will yield out to the depth of vegetation adjacent to it. And again, this will be our enclosure for the courtyard area between these four minarets. And now the reflective quality of it. Basically, it can visually look like it's the exact same image if you have the right light and sort of photographically it condenses. It just seems like we're flipping the same architecture upside down. And so what's reflecting what here? The reflection seems as strong as that. In a drawing and a sketch, you want to give less intensity to what's happening in the reflection, so we know that this is actually a moving body of water. But in terms of what it reflects, it's very rational in terms of it's exactly like a mirror. So it's going to show exactly the same image that's up above it. So we can take those lines of this part of it, come down to here, flip over that size of everything that's going on here. And the break point is simply the water's edge, right by the horizon line across the way from us. So everything we see here, we drop down. We're going to drop down even sort of a sketchier format. You want to line it up so it's always true to the information there. But even the trees now, if they curl back here, they're going to curl back in the opposite direction there and then end at the same distance. So you're just doing the exact same shape that's on line with the subject matter we've already sketched in. And so right away, it's got a little sense of reflective quality to it, but we're going to add more to it to show its power in terms of creating more of a sight condition when you have a waterway in front of a magnificent building. So what we'll do is we're going to run some of the greenery on the opposite side of the property, which go beyond here, and this will trail off to the edge over here to the left. And that'll be a value to us as the building stops. And so we'll match that to growth. And now we're going to take a value for trees and just make it a lighter version. Now, to give some idea of making this more of an actual reflection of it, you can take this distance and match it and then shift the movement of that plane around. So now I've got that speaker's platform the same distance away from our devising line. So this one's even further, so it's off the page. This is just this wall. It's going to come up to the box level. So whatever depth this is will be picked up here. So we've run out of paper to actually get to the domed zone for this, but this is enough to show that it'll be a waterway by the time we're done. And then this box comes up a little bit shorter. And once we get the windows fenestrated in there, we're going to do some hints of it here to show its reflective quality. So let's go into those areas of windows, because we're sort of at the time now where we want to use our full value. And just to keep reiterating this, that our responsibility to our media is to use the paper and make the paper, when you leave it white, to be poignant of why you're leaving it white. Not just because you stopped drawing, but because you wanted to save that white area for a particular reason within the context of your drawing. And then obviously all architecture is really found between 30 and 60 or 70%. The world out there is a series of grays. And yet what shows off the most for us is what you leave white and what you eventually value in with a very strong black at the right end. And so that's what we'll start doing now by coming to the top and working our way back down. We'll simply come in and do those values with a couple of strokes of black. And sometimes I'll even put the strokes adjacent to each other. There can be a little bit of white between them. So it seems like there's some activity in there and not just a walled off piece of black curtain behind it. Shows some light moving about through the space. And then the shallow dome that supports it. And the rotunda that supports the shallow dome as it moves about. And then even the blind arches have got some differentiation in tone that's receiving less of the wash of the sun there. And then we've got an arcade down below. So be careful here. They're very slender columns, so make them thicker now. And make sure you hold on to their thickness as you employ your value between the columns. So work gentle first, and if you want to make the columns thinner, you can add the value to it. If you try to do it too quick in the beginning, your columns might get too thin and too frail for what job they're supposed to be doing sort of structurally. And like I mentioned before, there's a two-story structure which wraps around the edges for it, secondary rooms and the practicum of the mosque from daily activities. And then various stages that build up that are orthographic. They're flat and they're not in the rotunda or in the hemispherical dome, but they're all receiving light. So it's kind of a composition that's only going to pick up when it casts shadow adjacent to it. So some pieces will pull off and show that. And now we'll come back into the minarets, because beneath each one of the little projections, there's a cast shadow. And so now we can come back in knowing that these are going to be flipped in here. We're not going to do them quite as articulate as these, and we're not going to enhance them later on. We're simply going to call in and say that there's going to be, along these lines, which you want to be true to, that array of dimensionality. So in this case, it's just going to be a little bit more of a scribble, because if you scribble it in, it seems like the water movement is changing the performance of what's happening in terms of an actual image. And that's when it'll enhance the idea of it being reflective. So you don't have to be too clear on these as we build that out. Same is true over here, just the idea of that happening. And then right where the water meets the land is typically a very dark line, because it's sort of the edge of the water and then what it does to the material that's right there. And that starts some lower surface where the eye height is, which is usually darker. So right where they meet, you can go ahead and put in, again, not a true content of the same line there, but something that's moving, because that's the water's edge. That'll separate the two units, because you don't want to make them as a singular image. And that helps do the waterway. Now, to change that, because you want the brilliance in the stone here, typically reflection is going to be a percentage duller, a percentage less striking. So to make the white of the light of the mosque seem more dominant here, we're going to come in and do a stroking of tone, and it could be large ones and short ones, just to give us a change of value here. And we're going to make that value go right up to the water's edge. A little bit stronger at the water's edge. So there definitely is a change of value culture between the two parts of the drawing, the actuality of it and the reflection of it. And now to kind of help this point kind of work, you can also come in and say in the distance, if the water is moving, it's directionally parallel to the base of the land. And so you can come in and do little horizontal squiggles of lines, which are going to be very tight together, because the distance between this one and this one is the same between this one and this one. So it gives a sense of perspective that if we do a lot of squiggled lines in the distance towards our subject, we're saying that that distance is the same as from here now to here. And so we can show a little more detail on the water there, maybe, but we want to compact in more line work. So now all of a sudden, the ground plane seems horizontal and is pushing towards our subject matter. So we'll drop these down and show some structure for the trees along the area there next to the courtyard. And we'll drop a value at the base of those trees. So we'll see there's differentiation between the foliage of the trees and the brilliant stone of the Blue Mosque courtyard. And that'll go right up to the edge. And now it's time to kind of think about where we want our line value to be strongest to make it crisp against whatever the subject is adjacent to it. So obviously we're back again looking at edges conditions. So obviously the top of the dome comes down and then returns. There's a little bracket here on both sides. The underside changes. And then the four bastions with small domes on the four corners are very strong, powerful edge condition pieces. And that'll take us over to the right side of the dome as well. And its little finial on top of the dome. On the left side of every turret. For the minaret. Probably make the ones as crisp as possible with a nice sharp pencil, the ones that are closest to us, the front two here. Strengthen those lines all the way through on the left side. You could probably even give a little more value to the top since it's all white adjacent to it. And there are a couple of tiers of secondary windows along the way as it steps up to support the structure of the building. It comes over and eclipses that one. And if you want to hold the form a little bit, you come down here as that becomes dark valued in there, and above here you see a little bit of that dark. You could then give a little bit of darkness in the reflection to the minarets that are rising above, just so they hold their form closer to you. And then we can do a little bit with some of the closeness of value now, that little rim here that runs over here, to get that to spin more. Maybe your shadow wants to be darker right when it makes that turn and darker at this edge. Same is true here. Really push the value into that corner. And then over to this corner. Value to that edge, wrap that around. It's just a matter of enhancing until you finally come and get to a point of clarity. Perhaps on the blind walls here, this edge will have more of a shadow line on the right. And then because we'll see more of a dark at the top of the arches down below and then drift back down to the value already employed. That'll strengthen that base a bit. And we can do the same for these small windows over here, just another layer of black in the top third of those, kind of randomized. Kind of animate that part of the facade. There's a horizontal number here. So now, again, at the size of the scale with somebody across the way who might be waving back when they're walking close to a horizon line, they're probably at this scale by the river's edge. So again, most of these major ecclesiastical buildings are monumental in scale for the centerpiece of the faith-based. So for the sake of removing sort of our perspective lines here, we could do a little bit of a wash, which will again bring this up. So I think I have pencil left over from earlier sketch. It already has the oblong space from beyond its side here. So I'll go back to that and I'll take a wash that's going to go right behind our minarets and up to the edge of the white there, and then continue next to the white here. So I want to use that tone of the sky to move across as a sheet. So start out with strokes and try to blur it with having no strokes at all and just being a tone. And then we'll take it all the way across so we catch the light hitting here. So there's a white tone adjacent to it. And that'll make that brighter and brighter as we do the tone adjacent to it. And then that line work will get a little bit lost in the tone there. Sometimes I like the construction lines even showing because it just says it's no more than just a sketch. It's just about the idea of the building. And then we'll have it kind of, instead of being the same thing all the way across, we'll have it kind of drift up and away to the right. So because the sky's got its own kind of horizontal plane as it moves across the structure of the subject here. And it'll just trail off as we catch this other line here. And that'll kind of eliminate that linear quality of that perspective line. And probably on this edge over here, we should probably clean this up and show more clarity, even though it's all bright stonework. We'll drop this down and just kind of show that edge or profile of the architecture as it makes its way down to grade. And maybe the water gets a little bit darker. Just that there's a left base here. And then something in the sky picks it up and makes the water over here a little bit lighter than what we're doing on this side. So it kind of moves the eye again from a density of value to kind of letting go, and the eye can drift across the page. The top of this is following this on a pyramidal arc. So it moves from an outer wing of rotunda to the upper rotunda. So this pattern here is going to start with a value on the right side, turn to white, and then have a value go back to gray on this side. So that moves across better. And maybe on this part of the dome, we'll come over and make this edge a little bit stronger adjacent to the sunlight up that shape on both of these. In the courtyard over here, they established on the western side of it a very large iron chain. And the chain is there on purpose because all the people who come there have to sort of bow and pay reverence to what the imam is going to speak about that day, because the space is ginormous on the inside, and yet their people can all see and hear the person very well because it's a singular space. The things vault from edge to edge here. So it's a really beautiful interior volume. But the this iron chain was drooped over the entryway so that even Sultan themselves, Ahmed himself, the only person who could actually come there on horseback and allowed to enter on horseback, still had to bow his head to otherwise you get knocked off his horse. And this ensured that even the ruler was still humbled from the god that he worshipped. So it's sort of this very flat in terms of layers of leadership becomes very common to all the people in the faith when you embrace the mosque proper. So maybe the tops of the trees then can go against the white of the sky. And probably some behind the trees might get some cast shadow of the buildings of the edge of the mosque coming down the ground there. And because we're so far away, we wouldn't see too much attention to the detail of all the stonework here. Once you come closer to it, you see all the sort of graphic effect of the skin of the material, but this far away, it kind of washes out. So again, our goal here with the illusion of perspective is we used our line work to create the three-dimensional form and the mechanics of perspective. Then we also push towards the idea of value so that, again, the white here should look brighter than your white over here due to the optical illusion effect of sketching in perspective. See you next time when we continue with architecture from the Muslim culture.